Good evening, everyone. This is Anoosha Shaigan. I'm a technology lawyer by qualification, and I currently head legal ops and strategy at JS Bank's new venture capital division. You'll hear more about it in the coming days. We are grateful to Park Launch for giving us the opportunity to discuss the legal aspects of the startup ecosystem in Pakistan. And we're joined by some very established names in the country and working abroad to give us insights into what this is all about. I think we're joined by Taimur and Zahra at the moment, and we'll shortly be joined by Mubariz as well. So just to introduce our guest speakers, we've provided detailed introductions for them in the event description in case anybody has specific questions for them or wants to reach out. But to quickly go over their introductions, so Taimur Malik is an international lawyer. He's a partner at Clyde Co, and he advises various governments, investors, startups, well, everybody you can think of in the country and abroad in other countries as well. And he's an eternal optimist and my former boss. So good to see him here today. We're also joined by Zahra Abid. Zahra is a partner at Haidermota Co, and I believe she's based in Karachi. Zahra does not have, she has a limited social media presence, but I hear that she remains the most sought after lawyer in the country anyway. So you might want to connect with her later. We will shortly be joined by Mubariz as well. Mubariz Siddiqui is currently an independent practitioner, but he has also served as general counsel for Sarmaya Car and Baikia in the past as well. Legal advisor for Baikia and general counsel for Sarmaya Car. So just to start things off, may I please request the guest speakers to provide a bird's eye view of the startup ecosystem in Pakistan from a lawyer's perspective. We'll start off with the positives, of course. Is this kind of like a get-rich-quick scheme? Is this a boom? What is happening? Does the government have very favorable policies for it? Is everybody moving towards it because there are no more employment opportunities available? So what's going on? And in the same discussion, if somebody can also share with us what a startup actually means. What is a startup? Who are startup lawyers? Who are the stakeholders that we as lawyers engage with, whether it's startups, entrepreneurs, founders, governments, regulators, investors, venture capitalists. So how does that process work? So an overview first, any favorable policies in Pakistan, and maybe a bit about the legalities just to begin with. Taimur, should we start with you?
Sure. First of all, thank you. And thank you, Park Launch, for organizing this with some brilliant panelists. Anoosha, you said I'm an eternal optimist. I think I'm more of an optimist when it comes to the startup world as well. I think the startup ecosystem in Pakistan is going to be a great enabler if it is not already one. It is creating opportunities far beyond just the business domain for the founders and team members of these startups. I see this as a future future of government, future of business, future of industry in Pakistan, and that's exactly what's happened elsewhere in the world as well. So established business houses, watch out. The startups are on their way. And I think it's also encouraging to see that the government, and I think it's not related to any particular political government, but I think generally the government and the regulators and the bureaucrats have come to a realization that a lot needs to be done to enable this ecosystem, and steps are being taken in this respect. I'm sure Mubariz has been very involved with SECP and State Bank over the last few years. Will shed some more light on it. But generally very hopeful, very positive. There are now startups in Pakistan in each and every sector that you can think of. There are dozens of startups in the edtech space, in the health tech space, in the logistics space, in the quick commerce space, in agri-tech, where definitely more can be done, given how Pakistan is in terms of an agricultural country at the moment. So those are my initial opening remarks, but happy to hear from Zahra and Mubariz.
Sure. Zahra, if you've joined us, can you please share your thoughts as well?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Anoosha, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I agree with Taimur. I think it's been a long time since we've seen some innovation even within the legal sector in Pakistan, and I think this has been a good incentive for us to kind of perhaps go back to scratch and start thinking about new things, because I think us lawyers in Pakistan at least get used to do a lot of typical stuff like M&A, and I think that's one big misconception that people have here, is that everybody tries and puts startups and the VC space into, like, everybody wants to make it sound like it's, well, an easier version of an M&A deal, but it's actually really not that. I mean, it kind of forces you to kind of go back and think about it from a very different perspective, in terms of from a founder's perspective, from a business perspective, and then obviously from an investor perspective. My personal journey in this space, I think, started off with the private equity side of things and not the venture capital side, which is an interesting thing about the Pakistani, I think, the Pakistani space, because at least my experience has been, and I'm not too sure whether Taimur and Mubariz agree with this, but I think the PE space kind of started off in Pakistan before the VC space kind of caught on. And therefore, at least my journey started off with that, in terms of the first few funds that came into Pakistan for the private equity space. And then suddenly, I think that kind of saw a halt. And then suddenly the VC space just took over as a boom. And that's, I think, even as a firm for us, kind of, we realized in terms of how fast, this boom spread. And it really forced us as lawyers also to kind of join the bandwagon and consider this as a unique opportunity for us as well, and grow with the founders and grow with the investors, and be part of a journey for a business from start to end. Usually we lawyers, again, started off with, M&A deals where businesses were merging, acquiring established businesses, big business houses. But I think this sector has forced people to kind of go back and see how they can be part of a journey from start to, and take it to an M&A deal. And that's what I find exciting about this space from my end. But again, I think I agree with Taimur that the space could not have developed without the support of the regulators and the government as well. And we've seen some very strong policy initiatives from the government, very strong support from the regulators as well. Of course, it's Pakistan. There are always hurdles in the way. I mean, but I think that's where, if the regulators and the lawyers work together, and this is again one of the unique things about this space, that there's been a lot of activity and a lot of interaction between the lawyers and the regulators to bring this space where it is right now. So I think for me, it's been an exciting journey, and I look forward to it. I think this is going to be a big one for Pakistan.
Right, thank you. Mubariz, if you can hear us and if you've joined, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'll just build on what Taimur and Zahra just added. First of all, thanks for having us here. Essentially, what I think is unique about what's happening in Pakistan now is that in the first time in Pakistan's history, capital is flowing towards people. People are actually investing in people as opposed to just assets, right? Historically in Pakistan, capital has gone towards land, capital has gone towards Pakistan generally has been a casino economy with guaranteed casino type returns, and
Nice.
Pakistani investors are kind of used to low risk, absurdly high returns, generally in property, and some other things. And even when you look at infrastructure projects where foreign investment has come in, we've guaranteed ridiculous, I mean, because we've had to, because of our own history, that's another thing, but we've guaranteed ridiculous, like 20% IRR type returns. Right now, what's happening in Pakistan is, the first time in its history, people are investing in people. Now, when you invest in people, what you realize is that the reason why it hasn't happened so far is because you have a pretty weak enforcement mechanism. You have the law favors anyone, at least as far as your courts are concerned, they favor anyone who wants to stop things from happening, as opposed to make things happen, right? So if an injunction could give you leverage, the courts work for you. If it doesn't, the courts don't work for you. So typically, when you're investing in an early stage company, you're taking a bet on the founders which could go either way. That's why we have so much foreign capital coming in. And as we are seeing the nature of businesses evolve, and the other aspect that's happening now is that given how young our population is, there's this desire to make documented businesses in Pakistan, which was not there before, because these documented businesses the requirement for documentation is coming from institutional capital, usually from abroad. Typically, to start a business in Pakistan, you would just have a business on cash. You won't really need to register anything. And still right now, I fundamentally believe that starting an undocumented business in Pakistan is much easier than starting a documented business in Pakistan. So there's this whole new wave of change happening because of this demand for by young entrepreneurs to change. But yeah, I do think the regulators so far have added quite a bit to support younger entrepreneurs and support this new form of capital coming into Pakistan. But I think a lot more needs to be done.
Right, thank you. So if either of you or all of you can just quickly share about how the startup cycle or the fundraising cycle or the ecosystem generally, how is it structured? Who are the key stakeholders? And is it necessary for every startup business to be raising capital or funds from venture capitalists or foreign investors? So can you please identify a hierarchy or a structure or a cycle? How is it structured, just for the understanding of the younger lawyers who are joining us and would like to enter the space?
I mean, let me just say that, first of all, just building on what Zahra said earlier, this is a new dimension. And I think startup law it's sometimes perceived as being the easier part of corporate law or company law. That's not the case. I think in traditional businesses, in relation to traditional entities, you are familiar with, what needs to be done, what kind of agreements are in play. That's not the case when you talk about startups. So there is also an expectation that that startup-related legal services would be cheaper because people are starting off with limited funds and hence can't pay as much as established businesses. So I think a lot of us do the startup advisory work out of interest and passion as well, and that's not just in Pakistan. I would say that's the case abroad as well. The startup space. And founders and initial team members need to think about a lot of things, starting off from, because these are technology-enabled businesses, so the play in relation to not just Pakistan focus, but more regional and international IP, trademark right protection, agreements with their initial angel investors, whether these are safe agreements, convertible notes, or even in equity arrangement, establishment of a holdco abroad.
You'll have to explain all those terms as we go into the conversation.
No, I'm sure that one of us will pick up on that. And so all of these things need to be considered, which are at times not at play when we are talking about the businesses around us that we see. The other thing is that I think we have to really support and commend everybody who is involved in this, in terms of especially the founders and the team members who join these startups, because they are helping enable more employment generation in the country. They are helping enable innovation through technology and other means. They are trying to improve business efficiency for us, and as well as in terms of our social and practical day-to-day needs, from ride-hailing to grocery delivery to all sorts of technology startups that we now benefit from. I think they are making our lives a bit easier and more comfortable. So we need to enable all of this, not just from a business point of view, but also from a very personal point of view. So on that, I would ask maybe Zahra or Mubariz if you want to then add from a more local perspective.
Sure, Zahra or Mubariz, yep.
Sure. I think just to build on what Taimur said, I think, again, the difference here, again, is that obviously there are different funding rounds. And the interesting bit is that you already have a fair idea of what your journey will look like if your business is successful. So whether you start from a pre-seed round, going on to a seed round, series A, B, C, and that's how the funding rounds typically work out. And if you're doing well, you'll hopefully reach Series C and then you're up and running that way. But again, I think the difference really is the approach is different, and therefore that reflects in the kind of terms that you're agreeing with. So if you look at pre-seed rounds, obviously the risk appetite is much greater. So even the investor mentality is different, the approach is different, the terms will be different. And as you move along, the terms keep on varying. So for instance, you would not see something like a liquidation preference in a general M&A deal, which would effectively just give a preference to an investor upon, the business going bust or upon a change of control scenario, so on and so forth. But that's the unique terms that have developed in this space, and which you will not find in a typical M&A deal. So yes, I agree with Taimur that you have to kind of see it from a different perspective as a lawyer as well, because that's how the founders and investors are seeing it. So, and that's basically how it runs through. So I think, like he mentioned, there are a lot of different terms attached to those funding deals as you move along, whether it's a liquidation preference, then you will see a lot of different, classes of shares, again, is something that is not typically used in an M&A deal, just, unless there are certain very complicated terms where you want different voting rights and so on and so forth. Here, it's almost like a given, like an investor would automatically want a preference share with certain preferences attached. How we pull that off in the Pakistani market is where the interesting things start, because a lot, like you'll see two different approaches in Pakistan on that. One is how you navigate through the regulatory space. Earlier on, a preference share was required SECP approval. And the typical Pakistani mentality is to try and avoid going to the regulator for certain approvals to kind of speed up the process, which would then mean us lawyers coming up with ways of trying to come up with contractual preferences versus proper preference shares being issued through amendments and constitutive documents. Now, this is where the difference of approach comes. If this was a classic M&A deal where we were being asked to do a preference share, we as lawyers would perhaps turn around and say, you should do it the right way, you should amend your constitutive documents, get the SECP consent and move forward. But if you look at the VC space, because time is a factor, everything needs to be done tomorrow, yesterday, that kind of just changes the outlook of things. That's where you start developing things like contractual preferences. So you keep your ordinary share, but give shareholders contractual preferences, and you rely that they will basically play ball, right? There'll be no scenario where there's going to be a breach, and that's how you move forward. So I think these are the kind of different things that we've seen in this space, and that's how we've reacted to that. But in essence, it's basically a series of funding rounds. And that obviously can have all kinds of investors, whether in the starting space, starting pre-seed, seed rounds, you look at your family members, you look at, friends, or angel investors. Moving on to the more serious rounds, you obviously have international investors, VC players, institutional investors at play. Now we have local funds as well in Pakistan. So that's also an exciting space that has developed. We're just not looking into investments in startups, but we're also looking at funds being set up to kind of channel local money into these startups. So that's my perspective, Mubariz, if you want to add something on that.
Yeah, no, thanks for putting it that way, because I think when we talk about startup funding and say the legal aspect of it all, the stage that we're at is matters a lot, right? It would determine the mindset that the investor has. It would determine the kind of risk profile they're taking. And whenever you're thinking about deployment of capital, and as lawyers, what we think about essentially is the risk, right? And what is the risk appetite that the investor has, and what is the risk profile of this capital? So whenever there's a pre-seed investment or a seed level investment, even like pre-series A, etc., what we're looking at is this is the riskiest form of investment that there is, even for the investor. They're entirely backing the founders based on who the founders are, based on what their credentials are, and even if things don't work out, that's just a very high risk bet. So in early stages, what we typically see is very low due diligence, almost none, because a business hardly exists. There's a pitch deck and a dream. What we also see is the documentation level is very minimal, right? So Y Combinator, which is one of the most famous incubators in the world, they invented this legal instrument called the SAFE, Simple Agreement for Future Equity. The entire point was for the investor to give cash first and get equity later whenever someone else would value the company at a particular valuation, do the due diligence, and actually do a valued round. So the investor could just invest today and let the founder execute and build something off of it, right? So these instruments were created so that early stage investment involved minimal friction from a legal, regulatory, or a paperwork standpoint. And as things progress, so say for example a Series B looks like a large-scale M&A deal, where sure, certain terms like Zahra mentioned, like liquidation preference, anti-dilution protection, etc., you would not find them in any other deal or typical deals. But largely, as far as documentation is concerned, as far as due diligence is concerned, it's typically like a typical M&A deal. So yeah, so startup law also varies depending on where you are in terms of fundraising.
Right, thank you everyone. So can you please identify what the current legal or regulatory framework is in Pakistan when it comes to startups? Just like the main laws, perhaps any expected changes to any of the policies in case the incumbent government, does not stay on for too long, or any regulatory changes that we might foresee in the near future with regards to maybe raising funds through equity rather than capital, or initial coin offerings, or Bitcoin perhaps. So can you take us through the specifics of the legal framework that exists in Pakistan at the moment for startups? This is a question from the people with us, by the way. Taimur, you want to start maybe?
So I think the first thing we have to understand, as Mubariz was just saying, is that it's a different risk profile in relation to startups. And one of the regulatory changes I think that will still be required is to make closure of companies related in the startups space easier. So liquidation process is still a nightmare, even if one can form a company within days or weeks with local shareholders. It's not that easy to close a company. And as we know that a large percentage of the startups anywhere in the world are likely to fail, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Many of the more successful unicorn, which is billion-dollar company founders, have had previous failed startups. So I think we will need to accept that can happen. The investors will need to accept that this can happen, and that it wasn't somebody's negligence or a malafide which led to that failure. We should not see cases against those founders or the startups that the money was taken but nothing really happened, because everybody, as was pointed out earlier, this time the money is being invested in people and ideas. There are no assets involved initially in most startups. So I think we as a country need to see how the overall regulatory framework will improve. The other aspect related to that is that as local funds, especially those backed by state money, get involved in the space, we should also be concerned, or there should be clarity that they won't be sanctioned through state audits and all that moving forward, because otherwise that will prevent people from taking money from such state sanctioned funds. So I think it's a change in approach overall, which perhaps should be forthcoming in relation to whether a change in political government or not, whether now or in 2 years will make a difference. I doubt that will be the case, because the change is coming from within the system now. I think there is a realization across the political spectrum, across the regulatory bodies, that this is a space that we need to enable as a country. And now, no change happens overnight, and maybe later we can touch upon the changes that have already made to the Companies Act, or maybe Mubariz can pick up on that now, how the definition of startups is now which was inserted recently, or the changes to the foreign exchange manual as well. But changes have certainly taken place, but we need to encourage our startups to think big, and for that the rules and regulations need to be relaxed further, even if it's specifically in relation to companies which can be defined as startups, which are not necessarily technology startups. Mubariz.
Yeah,
Right,
absolutely.
Mubariz and Zahra, yes.
Yeah. So no, as Taimur rightly pointed out, there's a lot that has already been done, right? And this is unprecedented. Like State Bank of Pakistan allowed holding companies, I think it was a year and a half in the works. I remember we first approached them in November 2019, and by February 2021, the law around holding companies was out. It has its own confusions. There's a lot that could have been done better. But just to give you some context, recently was in conversations with Startup Bangladesh and a few venture capital funds in Bangladesh who were talking about how they still have that restriction where Pakistani residents cannot incorporate holding companies abroad. As a result, only 2 Bangladeshi startups have gone into Y Combinator in their history, right? And if both of them had foreign resident founders. Now, the point is, credit to the government so far, they have actually made some meaningful changes to the laws, from allowing private companies to set up ESOPs, share buybacks, which are crucial in certain stages, making it easier for us to create different classes of shares, to allowing holding companies. I think these are very meaningful changes, and they would have a very significant impact. It's just that a lot more needs to be done to allow more and more, like Taimur rightly said, we can't just be focused on startups or tech startups. There's all these other sorts of businesses as well. If Pakistan is going to document a majority of its economy, it has to be super easy to start a documented business. So just to give you a simple example, if you're going to register a partnership or as an association of persons with the FBR, they want you to have an office address and paperwork to prove that you do have a rented office space, right? Now, the challenge with that is that what this law or this regulation fails to recognize is the new kind of business, which is a person sitting in their drawing room and starting off a business without any office at all. Now, it's small things like these that are still creating issues. Similarly, with opening bank accounts, it's harder for businesses, I think. But once the recognition settles in, that a lot of businesses in Pakistan would look not like what a traditional business has looked so far, I think more of our laws would also start moving in that direction.
Right, thank you. Zahra, would you like to add to what the laws exist, or the regulatory framework that exists, or any expected changes in the coming days?
Yeah, sure. So I think the 2 primary areas of legislation that's seen some real movement on the startup side is obviously general company laws and the foreign exchange side. And I'm sure most of us know that the whole concept of startup company has now been introduced. It was introduced in the foreign exchange laws, and that was obviously categorized based on how many years you've been incorporated for, revenue size, equity size. And a similar definition, not exactly the same, but a similar definition has also now been introduced in the company laws. But I think it's also important to note, like Mubariz said, a lot needs to be done. Even though enabling legislation has come forward in the company's law, there's still, obviously, the SECP has to still come up with the rules and regulations to enable that. So you'll obviously find a lot of provisions in the Companies Act now talking about enabling buybacks and enabling ESOPs, but they're all qualified by as may be specified. So I think we all await those as may be specified rules and regulations to have more certainty as to which directions this is going in. So that's one side. Also, I think, like Mubariz mentioned, it all started off with the IT space, but we've now seen that the whole startup side has moved into the payments system sphere. It's moved into the finance side, the NBFC laws. And again, I think there still needs to be some form of recognition from the regulators that, again, you cannot expect these businesses to provide you the same level of documentation that they are contemplating within their regulatory framework. So the kind of requirements, like I'm sure Mubariz would understand, a lot of experience-related requirements that they're expecting for these kind of businesses is something that's difficult for these startups to meet. So I think they have to do a little bit of groundwork, but I think we've seen the SECP understand, at least for SECP and the State Bank, they are showing that flexibility. But again, I think from my perspective, the startup side has kind of encroached upon the payment system sphere. There are a lot of startups who want to like eventually become PSO, PSPs, EMIs. There are a lot of startups who are now going straight for non-banking finance company licenses. And then you have now recently what's come up with the special technology zones, and everybody's excited about that. So I think a lot of things are happening, but I think, again, there's, like Mubariz said, a lot needs to be done, but it requires a lot of regulatory facilitation and liaison with the regulators to kind of pull through this, entire series of changes that are happening.
Right.
Anoosha, if I can
Yeah.
just add to this, while we're on this topic, for example, we've heard a lot that holding companies now can be established abroad. That's correct. There's some processes there, but at the moment, our understanding is that if somebody establishes a holdco abroad, then the money raised at the holdco level in the first year, 80% of that has to come to the Pakistani entity, and in the first 3 years, 50% of that still has to come to the Pakistani entity. And my view on that is that when Pakistani startups are creating holdco abroad, and we have seen this in the case of many of our, our startups which have raised larger rounds recently, that they are also looking to expand regionally, right? So, do we want to prevent our startups and hold their hand and say you can only do business in Pakistan? I don't think that should be the case. We should help create regional, global unicorns from Pakistan. And in order to do that, we'll have to be a bit more brave. I can understand the concerns of our financial regulators that they don't want capital flight, or they don't want people to just raise funds abroad and use them elsewhere for other purposes. But I think that's the kind of approach that we are talking about that needs to change when we are dealing with startups. And ESOP was mentioned. Most people would know what that is, but that's an employee stock option plan. If talented workforce is joining a startup, they're not doing it just for the monthly salary, right? They want to, they're taking a risk. They want to be rewarded for it. So employee stock options should be given. More and more startups are allocating, employee stock option plans in their equity structures, and investors are insisting on it as well. So, but there needs to be, detailed regulations on how these will be implemented. Likewise with the conversion rules. I mean, you sign a convertible note, or a safe agreement, as Mubariz explained, where you have a right to, your investment being converted into equity in the company or shares in the company upon a certain event at a certain valuation cap. How do we make it more seamless in terms of, actually happening, instead of just being a contractual arrangement, which then needs to follow through the entire process. And the final thing on this, I would say, is that a lot of international investors, and when I say international investor, not just institutional investors, but individuals as well, overseas Pakistani, in many cases, second, third generation overseas Pakistani are investing in these companies. And when they need to send documents from abroad to, let's say, acquire shareholding in a company or to sign any other type of documents, they have to do it, go through a lengthy notarization and legalization process, which is one, time consuming, second, very expensive at times, considering the amounts involved. So I think we need to simplify that. There has been some, I think Zahra, Mubariz, Ahmed Uzair, and Daksum, I mean, we've all sort of over the years written to these regulators, to the government, saying that things should change, become more simplified. So maybe Pakistan will one day sign an apostille convention and simplify, but at the moment that is a challenge. The other thing we should recognize and realize is that SECP has a regulatory sandbox, which now allows new ideas to be tested in a controlled regulatory environment, even if no clear regulations exist in relation to those. So a couple of questions I see are related to, crowdfunding platforms, and so on. So that's exactly the kind of ideas that have gone through these sandbox. Results are awaited, regulations are awaited at the moment, but at least things are being done. So let's see where this all goes. But over to you for future questions.
Right. So thank you everyone for sharing your insights and setting the stage for what the ecosystem generally looks like. We have a lot of questions. So may I request everyone to please keep their responses brief so we can cover as much ground as possible. So there was a question earlier in terms of, as lawyers, what do you see that the more successful companies have done that other startups may have not? Like, what do you think from a legal perspective? Is there, did they have better lawyers? Did they have better investors? What happened with the companies that became more successful?
I mean, look, if I have to start first, I'll just say that keep your books, both legal and financial, clean and proper and up to date as possible. I think startups, when they go through funding rounds and grow, they realize that at times they spend a lot of time on due diligence, which is, as Mubariz mentioned, maybe hasn't been done to that extent at the initial stages. So I think my takeaway would be that try and stay on top of your documentation, your agreements, and everything else to the extent possible. Mubariz, Zahra.
Zahra, Mubariz, would you like to add? What is one thing you think that more successful startups did differently? In fact, Mubariz was with Baikia, so what do you think Baikia did differently?
No, I'd be very honest. I don't think lawyers are as important to the process or contribute to a startup success as one we would like to think. Sure, certain areas could be different. If you are in a regulated space, say like Zahra mentioned, fintech, sure, I think there's a lot of legal requirement. Getting the licenses right early on, you need a lot of legal involvement when you're developing the product as well, because you have, say, your KYC, etc., has to go a certain way. Sure, on those spaces, but say a company like Baikia, I think the essential determinant of a startup success, especially in the early stages, is the people, is the team. And like Taimur rightly mentioned, the employee stock option, the investors force the founders to give some equity to employees because they need people who are incentivized, and their incentives are aligned with the investors and the founders, right? So yeah, it's people who have hired right, have gotten the right teams together, are more likely to be successful in the early stages.
Right, Zahra, what do you think?
I think I agree with both of them. I think whilst I completely agree and agree with Mubariz that ultimately, I think once you start a business, at that point in time, the legalese itself is not that really important because there's a lot more to do otherwise. But I think at the same time, I think there's a lot of shortcuts that are taken at that stage, which if avoided, can make life easy. And I think that's mostly in the regulatory space, whether it's licensing or documentation, like Taimur mentioned. These are simple things that I think can be worked upon and would make even their funding rounds easier, in terms of cost saving as well in the future. And also, I think in Pakistan, one has to realize that the landscape is not always that easy to navigate, whether it's with the regulators or otherwise. So sometimes those shortcuts can create far bigger problems in the future. And some of them end up being irreversible, right? And then that kind of leads to more complications. So I think a little bit of groundwork would be helpful for everyone, including the lawyers involved.
Right. So just to add to that, how important is it to register intellectual property rights for startups or for, maybe slightly established businesses? Are they important at all? Or, is it like something that's just relevant to technology companies or their software, or just limited to the logos? And at the same time, if lawyers are conducting due diligence, let's say, so there's, a whole process that involves document verification, fact checking and whatnot. But from a lawyer's perspective, do you have like lawyerly instincts that can identify if somebody's trying to scam you, or if somebody's not going to pay you back, or if somebody's not serious about what they're doing? So not formally, but do you think as a lawyer you're able to identify these kind of potential red flags when it comes down to it? So IP rights and due diligence, if we can get comments quickly.
So my suggestion is always to register some sort of IP, let's say in relation to the trade name, trademark, and key things. As some of you might know, IP rights are, even trademark can be classified under various categories. So you could be registering under 10 different categories in 10 different countries. So obviously that comes with a lot of expense. But in order to establish first use or early use, you could at least start with some category in some country, let's say Pakistan or wherever your holdco is, and start that process. If you've developed if you have a software or something else which needs to be copyrighted, I mean, that's a different dimension as well. Or if you have a IoT product or something else, then patents are important. So that goes without saying, because some of your value would be attached to your IP rights as well when your valuations are done later on. And your second question was?
Due diligence, like
Due
you
diligence.
have a lawyerly instinct, not going through the formal processes.
So again, my approach maybe lack of patience at my level now. But one thing is that I always insist that clients try to provide a complete data room or file with everything in it. I feel most of the lawyers' time is spent educating the client on what is needed, where to put it, and collating the documentation. I think the startups and their teams can do a lot of that work, which is not legal work, but actually organizational work themselves. And the more prepared they come to a lawyer or a counterparty's lawyer, the more confidence the lawyers get and the counterparties get, and that this is a proper organization doing a proper job. That's my view at least.
Right. Zahra and Mubariz, do you have any instincts to identify red flags?
I'm not too sure about instincts, but one thing's for sure that, again, I think this is one of the biggest odds between an M&A deal and a startup deal. I mean, your due diligence is going to be mostly red flags. We all know that. That's how it starts. That's the basic assumption you start with. So your due diligence report is more about recommendations on how to fix it, because you already know you have to take that view. You have to take a commercial view because it is a startup. So I think that is how we approach due diligence for a startup. It's more about solutions than really identifying red flags, because we all know there will be a lot of red flags. It's mostly identifying deal breakers from an investor's perspective, and that's pretty much it. As far as IP is concerned, I think this is one landmark change that the Pakistani side has seen. It is because of this whole VC startup space, the emphasis on IP in Pakistan. I think it's changed. The whole regime has changed. I mean, previously, I think probably 5-10 years back, there was hardly any emphasis on IP law in Pakistan. It was just a side thing. I mean, even in terms of like law firms like ours, we would not really focus that much on IP. But now with this whole space, IP is where it starts, because that's really where the value is for the business. And so I think it's one of the most important things that we look out for as part of a due diligence, and even in terms of a transaction structure, whether the IP is registered or not, whether it's supposed to be housed at the opco level, at the holding company level, all of those things matter. So I think I'd agree with Taimur that IP has suddenly, I think, become the topic when it comes to the VC space and the startup space.
Right, Mubariz.
Fully aligned. Just to top up on that, in relation to IP, depending on the stage of the business, which is very important. So generally, when Pakistan, most of the tech businesses that I've seen, not many have done something that's original, so to be patented. Very few have come across that have a legitimate patent claim. So mostly are essentially businesses that need to protect their trademarks, because they are going to be spending significant amount of dollars on marketing and acquiring customers. So the protection of their trademark and their business name is very important. Another aspect of IP, which is very important to look at the early stages, is whether the employees and the work that they do, whether that IP is being assigned to the company or the holding company. Like Zahra said, that structure is very important from these aspects. In terms of red flags from a due diligence point of view, so I worked at a VC fund where our job was to make an investment decision before the legal work started. So when we were making an investment decision, which is what we call a commercial decision, we looked at all sorts of things, which was, so in the earliest stages of a founder, when there's no company, there's no documentation, there's not much legal due diligence. Your due diligence is typically around what does the founder care about, how do they plan on acquiring the next 100 customers or the first 100 customers, why they're doing it is very important. It can't be just because it's cool to do this these days, etc. So yeah, red flags in those early stages, you're making a bet on a person, and they could really vary it could literally be anything.
Right, thank you. So there's a question related to GDPR. Maybe I can take that one. We do have a data protection and cloud policy in place. I think it's being debated upon, and hopefully somebody will legislate upon this soon. And in relation to that, there was a question earlier about website law and whether you can copy privacy policies and other policies from the websites of established businesses. I would say that's a big fat no. You really need to consider your own business or your offering or your service or product, and please get a professional to draft these policies for you. There's also, I'm trying to club all the similar questions together. So there's a lot of interest in how foreign funding gets to Pakistan. If somebody wants to invest in a business here, do they have favorable tax regimes? Is the remittance or repatriation process or the banking process smooth for them? Or as far as technology companies are concerned, there might even be concerns about double taxation. So is it cheaper tax-wise, or is it, should they be registered in other countries, the businesses? So like I see a lot of questions trying to ask the same thing. So if anyone can, sort of share some insights about foreign investment happening in Pakistan, like the actual process and how smooth it is.
So I'll let others speak about that, but I would like to highlight that Pakistan, it's not about Pakistan's legal system not being perfect. I think it's also a reputational issue why companies are established abroad, because the investors generally, and at the, at the initial stages, a startup founder doesn't really know, or the anchor investor doesn't know where the future investors are going to come from. If they're ambitious, they're looking at US, Singaporean, or now Middle Eastern. Middle East-based VCs and funds investing in them, and therefore the choice of the holdco jurisdiction at times is dictated by that. So it's the comfort of the current and future investor. So I think that will take some years for Pakistan to get to that point where we can say, no, our laws are perfect. Our lawyers are fully equipped to advise on these issues and take things from there. In terms of the process, maybe Mubariz or Zahra can explain that first.
Yeah,
Zahra,
okay.
Go ahead, Mubariz. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think in terms of tax, I'll take that tax question, and Zahra can talk about repatriation and all. In terms of tax, Pakistan is now in the process of offering some stellar incentives, right? I have to mention Special Technology Zone Authority, STZA, which is a fantastic initiative by the government of Pakistan, which offers complete income tax relief, relief around imports, custom duties, and all sorts of facilitation. The idea is to be that one facilitating authority for any foreign investor to navigate Pakistan, right? From incentives to general compliance. So I think that's a fantastic initiative. I'm actually something that I'm personally excited to see in Pakistan, and they have a pretty stellar team that's executing on that front. Other than that, like Taimur rightly said, it's not about whether we can fix all the laws tomorrow. Say if someone, say Tiger Global, one of the largest VC funds in the world, if they want to make an investment in Pakistan directly into a Pakistani entity, they will first need to hire people in Pakistan, do due diligence on the thing, learn more about the market. We're talking about deals or deal terms that are very novel, like for example, liquidation preference. Has liquidation preference ever been enforced in a court in Pakistan? No, it hasn't. How long does it take to enforce any contract in Pakistan? Takes very long. We've just seen actually good news for Pakistan is the Barrick Gold, Tethian Copper, the whole Recotec case being sorted all of a sudden. But all these years, when you back out of deals, you don't really give a lot of comfort to investors by doing those things, right? But we're fixing them, and it's not like Pakistan is uniquely being discriminated against. It's typical across the world. Even in India, investments are made through largely through holding companies. In Indonesia, you name it, most countries, MENA-based investments are also done that way. So yeah, this is something that's a commercial consideration, and these are commercial calls. Most of the funds have comfort around big holding company jurisdictions like Singapore, Cayman Islands, etc., and they route their money that way. But essentially, the money comes in Pakistan. So if Baikia raises money, they pay salaries here, they run promotional campaigns here, they hire people here, it gets spent here, the learning happens here. So yeah, typically we're still far away from direct investments in certain, at least in this segment, but the benefit to Pakistan is immense.
Right, Zahra, would you like to add?
Yeah, so I think I'll just add a few lines on the modalities of making that investment. I mean, largely there's just been two models here for the VC space. One is when the classic foreign direct investment route under the foreign exchange laws, whereby, like Taimur and Mubariz mentioned, the investors just pump in money directly into the local entity. And there also we've seen some key regulatory changes, because earlier on there were some restrictions in terms of divestment from those investments, restrictions on the foreign exchange laws on how much money could flow out of Pakistan, which was a dampener really for foreign investors, because when you talk about injecting money, there were no real such restrictions. But when you start talking about taking out money, there were restrictions on how much you could take out, including state bank permissions, which led to a lot of uncertainty. Then there was also certain restrictions in terms of the nature of the instrument that you were investing through. So if it's a loan, you would attract different kinds of permissions, because invariably you would end up in what we call a special permission, which is a prior approval of the central bank, because there was no straitjacket permission within the foreign exchange manual where you would fit in and therefore not require a state bank permission. So again, we would have to navigate in terms of whether it's plain vanilla equity, whether it's a loan, whether it's a preference share, which would then also attract a central bank approval. So those were the kind of complications that were arising for a foreign direct investment, which complications have to some extent been removed because the restrictions on divestment have been removed. Yes, there is still some requirement in terms of submitting evidence of price and valuation, which also is something that the market is not too happy about, but at least it's a start. And also we've seen some movement in terms of coming up with permissions for convertible loans for startup companies under the foreign exchange manual. So yes, even on the foreign direct investment side, there have been regulatory changes, which has kind of made it easier. But again, I think because of commercial reasons, like Taimur and Mubariz pointed out, the preference still largely remains for investors to invest money through holding companies. And that's how this whole holding company permission was what came out from the foreign exchange side. So that's really the two modalities of investment.
Right. Thank you, everyone. So we have only a last few minutes left. I would pose questions, and if you can answer individually, please, very, very quick responses. So do you think I might change the questions up a bit just to cover more general context? Do you think our ecosystem is more lucrative, provides more lucrative opportunities for services rather than the manufacturing sector? If anyone can just take that up quickly.
No, both. I think Pakistan doesn't make anything. We are an import-led economy. We don't produce enough things of our own. So I think we have a big enough market to make things ourselves and consume them.
And sell globally as well. Yeah. So.
And the STZA is supposed to facilitate all of that. So
yeah.
Right. Is it possible for locally registered early stage startups to pay consultants or other third parties through equities instead of cash? Or यहाँ पे वो Bitcoin वाली भी बात आ जाती है. Would you hire a lawyer for your startup and pay them in Bitcoin rather than like cash?
I take it. If you're paying Bitcoin, I take it. But yeah, you could.
One thing I would add is that, look, Pakistan has around 150,000 lawyers at the moment, and maybe 20 to 30,000 law students at the moment. Unfortunately, we only have 15 startup-focused lawyers or lawyers who are more familiar with this environment. So I think for the young lawyers on this session, I would say that if you're listening in, I would say explore this market. There is a lot of work to be done. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of startups coming up. It's so there will be room in that. This is the new form of business moving forward. So, and it's not that simple. As you have sensed during this session, we've that also tells us maybe we should do more sessions and on more specific topics, in the coming months.
Right. Zahra, I understand you work as external counsel for a lot of big companies and big businesses as well. At what point do you think companies or businesses should have in-house lawyers in particular, or startups, or or do they need a whole legal department or just one in-house lawyer, perhaps?
No, I mean, I think there are cost considerations involved to begin with in the starting phase. So, I mean, I don't expect them to have in-house counsels from day one. But I think, I mean, there are a lot of, young lawyers out there who look for internships and different things. And I think that's a class that they should really tap into, because once you're out of law school, at least you have the basic training to kind of help them in the basics. And in a lot of things, it's not really rocket science, to be very honest. Right now, the regulators are also very, again, like I mentioned, they're pretty accessible now relatively. If this was 10 years back, they would not be that accessible. But now it's just like, if you take the initiative, they will respond. Yes, it's an effort, but they will respond. So I think to that extent, it's a market that they should tap into, and that would not be very cost prohibitive either. So perhaps 2 years down the lane, I think you should have at least one person. Even if it's not full time, maybe it's part time, but somebody should be there to kind of help you with the basics. I think that is something that I would definitely encourage.
Right. And as far as young lawyers are concerned, is there any resource material that they could go through in order to understand the startup law or the startup space better? Or can any corporate lawyer or company lawyer join this space and learn on the job? Quick answers, please.
I think both are possible.
Sorry,
Please,
go ahead.
No, I've said both are possible. There's a lot of information and material online. There are a lot of online courses in different segments. I mean, not just startup law as it is. As you can realize, there is different IP considerations, the documentation related to investments and finance and fintech. So you'll need to do a lot of things. But depending on what your interest is in, and a general grounding of corporate commercial law obviously is important. Zahra?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know about Taimur Mubariz, but like we've all learned on the job, right? It's not like we did, VC specific courses or anything. But one thing that I have found interesting is that there are a lot of courses out there, and it's easier to now manage those courses because they're pretty flexible. And that's something that we are also actively looking into as a firm, to invest in our people to do those short courses online. I think that's a very valuable resource that is available out there that everybody should look into.
Also,
right. Mubariz,
I'm looking to hire if anyone's interested. I can help.
Sure.
I can help reach. Yeah,
sure. If I can get a quick answer from all three of you, what are some of the biggest mistakes entrepreneurs make from a legal perspective?
I think if entrepreneurs spend too much time on it too early on, they should just rely on standard advice. They should rely on what people typically do and move on. Don't waste too much time or energy on it.
Right. Taimur, Zahra?
Yeah, I think, be conscious. I think paperwork is important. I think keep your things together in one place. That's often the case with Pakistani startups, and also in MENA, that we see that's not the case. So that would be my one suggestion, regardless of what path you're taking based on the advice that you have. We had, so there are various examples. We can discuss that for some time, but don't worry too much about it. When Uber and Careem came into the market, they were not working in a field which allowed them or that kind of ride-hailing business to be done. Anyway, they have survived in most jurisdictions. So that's one way of looking at it. You do need a high risk appetite to be a startup founder as well. So keep that in mind. It's not for the faint-hearted.
So can home-based businesses register their residential address as their business address? Does anybody have an answer?
Yes,
My
yes,
view-
that's not a problem.
An address is an address. And the other thing is, I think there are questions regarding data protection and so on as well. Pakistan is going
GDPR,
to
yes.
pass a personal data protection law soon as well, which is now, I believe, largely based on GDPR, because the main objective is for international companies to take comfort in data being located in Pakistan, and because Pakistan then has the same kind of standards. Not seen the final draft, so let's see what is eventually enacted, and how it impacts. But that is another space that startups in Pakistan need to be aware of, because there will be serious financial penal consequences of non-compliance.
Right, so there was a question on whether crypto will be legal in Pakistan anytime soon. We hope so. We're working on it. We have accountability. We've suggested good accountability mechanisms to the government, and let's see if something gets accepted. Can the speakers please share some insights on where startups can find these lawyers? Well, Mubariz has offered one position, but do you know any places where they can shop for lawyers?
I think look around, look who's written about the startup law or spoken about the startup law in the Pakistani market, let's say. You'll find the people initially. But again, general corporate lawyers should be able to help guide you to some extent as well. Don't wait to be able to speak to a startup focused lawyer. I think that's not the case. In terms of reaching out, I think all of us are on LinkedIn. That's the way to connect now. So yeah, Zahra.
No, I agree. I mean, I agree with what Taimur Mubariz mentioned. Nothing to add here.
Yep. So if all of you can share, can wrap up what we've just discussed, and maybe share perhaps one law that you would like to reform or change or get promulgated, perhaps. So something that, we see as an actionable content moving forward. Just provide a general overview of how do you see the space and where would you like to see reform being made?
I would say the postal convention is important. I think one of the reasons people don't invest directly or deal in Pakistani companies directly is because of the whole hassle and the time that it takes. So if there has to be one takeaway, one easy fix, easy win, that's the one I would say at the moment.
I think from my perspective, I don't think I would want to mention any specific law that needs to be enacted. I would hope that the laws that have already been enacted be implemented the way they should be, because frankly speaking, I think in Pakistan, it's very easy. I mean, it may be relatively easy to come up with a law, but the implementation is what really matters. And I think we need to see some implementation now, and some meaningful implementation by the regulators, by the legal fraternity, by the business community.
Yeah, for me, not having a policy or clear law around crypto is a big injustice to Pakistanis generally. I think globally, Web3 is going to be the biggest or a big domain, and depriving Pakistani entrepreneurs from that domain, I think, is a big travesty. So yeah, I would love to see Pakistani regulators building a spine and actually doing something about it.
And if I can add one more thing to this, Mubariz mentioned a very important point initially, that we have to get away from this concept of getting injunctions. In Pakistani terms, that is a stay order. So our legal practice revolves around stay orders and maintaining the status quo. I think a legal reform around that would be something that needs to be pursued, because that's not conducive to doing business in any country. So, but that's a more general takeaway.
Right, so lots to look forward to. I hear that there are startups coming up in the metaverse as well. That would be very exciting to see. If any of you comes across that, I would love to be a part of it as well. And then there are contracts as well from the petrochemical or the chemical sector. they've kind of gotten rid of lawyers and they've started drafting contracts with universal symbols and emojis. So that's something really exciting. Similarly, you know, there's a lot of interest around cryptocurrency, of course. So a lot of things to look forward to in the coming days, hopefully. The best thing I feel about the lawyers in the startup ecosystem is that we could all be part of the same deal and still be working as collaborators rather than competitors and working towards a similar goal in order to get that deal sorted. So this is a very exciting space for lawyers. I would encourage more and more people to join. If you're looking for mentors, our speakers should be around to respond to your queries on LinkedIn, perhaps. You can still leave your comments under the video that was posted, and hopefully somebody will try to get back to you with responses, or maybe lawyers who are generally not allowed to advertise themselves would love to respond to those queries so that you know that they do have expertise in the area. And I would encourage lawyers to, you know, keep a lookout for such questions, and maybe you can share your insights with people who are actually looking for legal advice. Thank you to the speakers once again. Thank you for your time. Thank you to Park Launch for inviting us to have this discussion. And hopefully we'll see you again soon with other topics.
Thank you for moderating this. Thank you, and great to be on the panel with Mubariz and Zahra.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.